All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have a lot of folks online for this, which we're really excited about. So, welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about putting your best foot forward and building effective CVs and resumes. So, this webinar was sponsored by the Hunting, Trapping, Conservation Working Group, as well as the Student Development and the Early Career Professionals Working Groups. And so we have three wonderful guests today that are going to be talking about their various backgrounds and experiences and tips for different sectors of the wildlife career field. And so we have with us today Jerry Ann Albers from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. We have Dr. Val Titus from Paul Smith's College. And we have Dr. Kurt Verkateren from USDA Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center. And they're going to be going through their tips for CVs and resumes, but we've also posted these same tips on all three of those working groups' web pages that I mentioned earlier, as well as the student development Discord server. So you can always go back and find those resources at a later time. And of course, check the recording of this up that'll be up on YouTube. We're going to have lots of time for questions at the end, but as we are going through this, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. So not the chat, but specifically the Q&A, and then we'll go through and answer those when we have some time at the end. So now I would like to turn it over to our panelists. Thank you all.
Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate it. So as Amanda said, I'm Jerry Ann Albers. I'm with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, so I kind of represent state government for this presentation today. And we're going to just dive into some tips that we have for all of you when it comes to CVs. So our first big tip is that you want to have a CV. A lot of times, maybe if you go to your university's, your college's career center, they might recommend a resume. Resumes are typically one page. They have your work experience, your education, and then a few skills. But our field puts much greater value on a CV because it typically better encompasses the broad swath of experiences that we get as wildlife professionals. You know, we learn by going to conferences, we get experience by helping other people with their field work and things like that. And something like just a one-page resume doesn't really encompass that as well as employers would want to see. So we typically recommend off the bat just having a CV. CV is a curriculum vitae, that means the story of your life. And it's something where at the end of your career, somebody should be able to look at that and kind of understand the path, the trajectory you took through your career, and all the cool things that you did as a wildlife professional. So you want to work on having a CV available.
So when you are preparing your CV, there's a bunch of little picky things that we're going to talk about throughout the entire presentation. But one of the most important things is to make sure you have some kind of header on your CV. And this contains your contact info. And this is really if your CV is in a pile of papers and it gets all messed up, it's easy to reassemble your papers within a stack, and you should be able to we recommend actually adding numbers on the bottom so it can go back in the order that it was submitted as.
And then for your CV, you're typically starting with your education and then you're listing your work experience. And we typically recommend that you use a term like work experience rather than jobs or employment, because again, there can be a broad range of experiences that you get as a wildlife professional that maybe weren't a paying job, but you might have volunteered 40 hours a week for a conservation organization. They didn't pay you, but that was work experience and you should list it as work experience. There's also things like if you're in grad school and you have a teaching assistantship, listing that under your work experience because it is work experience that you are gaining. So we typically recommend start with education, work experience, but kind of use that broader term and think about the things that would count as work experience and not just your paid employment.
And be real cognizant of your wording. You need to be concise, but still clear on what you did and the specific skills that you have. Be careful, as the slide here shows. Don't be overly flowery or worry about finding some buzzwords to kind of spice yourself up. too much because employers will see through that. Be straightforward, be honest, and especially for federal jobs, if you've done a job duty that's in the posting, try to mirror that same wording because it may not always be the hiring official, the biologist, your future boss, who's looking at those CVs. It could be an HR person, so they're just kind of looking for to tick the boxes. Does this person kind of make the grade to get into the pile that's going to get interviews, or or not? So they may not really know that you said something that really means the same thing as some key word in that advertisement. But if you didn't say it, you might not make the cut. So try to mirror that wording as much as possible. And after you've got your education and your work experience on that CV, there's space for other categories of things that you've done that should reflect what the reviewers of those resumes are going to most value for the job that they have open. You won't necessarily need to tweak your CV for every job that you apply for, but depending on what you're looking for, you might have to have one CV that you have kind of tailored for more biologists, more fieldwork type jobs, where you're emphasizing your field experience. You might have another one if you're also interested in like education. You might have another CV that highlights those aspects of your skills and abilities, the education that you have, past work, so that you could really highlight things you've done relative to outreach and education. Especially for federal jobs, for your CV, be sure to kind of mirror that language. Like I mentioned, it'll be specific in those job postings so that if you've got the skill, you get credit for it and you kind of make it to the next cut. There's also instances, especially as you get further along in the career. I don't know who for sure is all in the audience out there, but there's quite often, if I'm, for example, applying for a grant or the kind of application it takes to be adjunct faculty at some universities, they just want a really tight CV. So it requires to have another copy that's kind of an abbreviated version that you sort of keep up to date. So keep that in mind too.
Yeah, this just came up for me just a couple weeks ago. I was writing a letter of support for a student who was applying for a fellowship, and they wanted a 2-page abbreviated CV. So
Yep.
that happens occasionally for things like that.
Now, we live in a world of acronyms. We use them all the time in the field, in our everyday lives. But one of the things you need to be careful of is to spell everything out. Don't use acronyms. Things that are common like GIS and GPS. There aren't too many other things that are GIS or GPS out there. So those are kind of common. But there are other exceptions that could be potentially be misinterpreted. For example, I used to work in the zoo field. And if I saw AI on a resume, I would assume that somebody has experience working with wildlife and artificial insemination, not artificial intelligence. So please make sure that you always spell it out so we know as employers what exactly you're talking about. I mean, we have lots of other acronyms like USDA, USGS, and so on, and we pretty much know what you're talking about there, but it's always good to spell it out just in case, just to make sure.
Yeah, to your point about AI, Val, earlier today, I'm looking at a project proposal related to avian influenza, another AI.
Another AI. Yep, and this came up for me with CWD the other day. We had our first CWD positive deer, chronic wasting disease in Indiana. But I was in a meeting and we were talking about CWD as coarse woody debris. So consistency is really important. You want to make sure you are being consistent throughout your CV in every way possible. Are you listing your dates in the same way? Are you using dashes consistently? Are you spacing things consistently? If you're writing out publications, are you using the same format for all of them? This consistency really shows attention to detail. And if an employer is looking and you're kind of doing one thing over here and then you're doing something else, they're gonna be like, I don't know about this person. They might set you aside just because they're worried about your attention to detail. And this is where having lots of eyes on your CV can really help. I mean, it does not have to be a wildlife person to help catch those things. You know, if your best friend's a nurse practitioner, ask them to look through it and they might be able to catch some of those, like your spacings all over the place over here and you're doing something totally different over here. Having extra eyes on your CV can really help you catch all those little things that you might have missed trying to do it yourself because you stared at it for too long.
Also, don't sell yourself short. There are a lot of things that we do on a day-to-day basis that we could potentially put on our CVs. If you are a avid angler and know how to back up a trailer and get the boat in the water, that is critical in a lot of cases in certain field jobs. Have somebody look over and look at your skills and see if they can think of something that you're really good at that you might not have thought. We often don't think about what kind of skills and categories we have. I mean, even if you speak another language, if you are an avid reader, driving tractors, being an artist, there are so many things you could potentially add to the CV. It might not be at the top in the important parts of the education and publications, but certain hard skills are very, very important to have. Chainsaw, any kind of certification. So make sure you have all the important aspects of other things that you do and other hard skills that you may have.
Another topic to include is references. A lot of times on people's CVs, they have no references listed, or it might say references upon request. Depending on how quickly somebody might need to hire the position, for example, that can really burn you to not have references there. Because if somebody then has to go chasing you down and you're on vacation or something, you may not be able to. So just put them in there right off of the bat. And typically, the number to include is 3. Make sure the people that you're using as your reference know that you're going to be using them as a reference. Get a little vibe from them that they're okay with that, right? Make sure that they're going to be able to speak favorably on your behalf. You don't want them to be blindsided with the call, so you need to let them know that you're applying for jobs. Maybe not every single job that you're applying for, but if you're just, hey, I'm looking for jobs, thanks for being my reference, expect some calls, I'm hoping to get some interviews. What else? Especially like for federal jobs, another point to remember is that as you're listing your work experience beyond just references, they have you list your supervisor and some other details. So it's good to maintain a list of the jobs that you've had. And usually you go back, several years. So in cases of someone who's kind of fresh out of college, going back into high school, jobs that you've had, the dates, the salary, supervisor names, and contacts. So there's potential that hiring officials will be calling those past supervisors. You could have in parentheses if it's okay to contact them or not, or if it's your current supervisor, you may say, contact me before contacting that supervisor. All those kind of contacts are real important, so be sure to include those references. And for that federal CV, keep that list kind of handy and current in case you might need it.
Yeah, and you never know when you might get a job where they're like, yes, who was your supervisor 6 years ago for this job you did for 3 months? So that definitely happened to me where I was like, what was her name again? Jeff, maybe? So even if you don't think you're going to need it, keep that anyway. A few other pieces of advice. There are some places that are starting to recommend photos. We, at this point, feel like there can be people who have unconscious bias, and the photos could help them jump to conclusions you maybe wouldn't want them to. I don't know if you remember the very first slide I showed, but there is a resume and there was a gentleman on it and he was looking up into space and he kind of looked like he was a hipster. Like if you see a photo like that, you might have made some assumptions about that person. I might make assumptions about that person. So right now we do not recommend photos just because of the biases that could come with that, even if it's unintentional bias. Some are also recommending hobbies, listing hobbies. This is one that you can consider including, but you want to be very thoughtful about it, right? You don't want to put hobbies that aren't your actual hobbies because you feel like you're supposed to like to do certain things. This is definitely something that I struggled with early in my career, especially as a plus size woman. I'd be like, yeah, I love camping. That's definitely my hobby, camping. I don't love camping, guys. I don't camp. I don't like it. But I felt like I had to like fit in. And so I would say and list things like camping and hiking that were my actual hobbies. So you want to make sure you're being genuine and actually reflecting who you are. Um, and then you also want to think about like, is listing certain hobbies going to give people certain perceptions? Again, that kind of unconscious bias or conscious bias in some instances. Like if you list that one of your hobbies is video gaming, is that going to make an employer think they're going to be up all night video gaming and then they're not going to come to work on time, right? So you want to be very thoughtful about if you're going to choose to list hobbies, and make sure they are genuinely reflective of you and your actual hobbies. Kurt, didn't you say that you sometimes like to see people's hobbies?
Yeah, I do. If I'm, depending on what the job that you're hiring for, it's something that may not really come out in the announcement, especially because of the space constraints and like the federal system. The PD sometimes very, very generic. But if somebody says that they're a backpacker, and I know that part of this job is going to include putting a 50-pound pack on your back and going to a study site to set a trap or whatever. I know, okay, this person suffered with a backpack before, they can handle this. So I really do like to see some hobbies.
Yeah. So there can be a place for them. You just want to think about how they might relate to the work you're applying for. And again, that's a personal choice whether to include hobbies, but just be thoughtful about it.
So basically, here at the end, you want to, well, at the end of this part anyway, you want to make sure you have somebody review your CV for errors. Some of those of you that are students, you certainly have professors that would be happy to look things over for you. Early career professionals, peer review with each other. Conferences are often a place where you can get help with CVs. Obviously, we know that the meeting in Baltimore has a couple workshops going on. Some of the regional conferences, like the Association Fish or AFWA, Association Fish and Wildlife Agencies, often those regional conferences have CV reviews as well. It doesn't hurt to have multiple people, peers, supervisors, professors. There's no real exact way how a CV should look, but getting multiple eyes on it and getting a lot of feedback will certainly reduce some mistakes and help with the formatting consistency. And it's always great to get that advice.
Okay, next we're going to launch into some kind of recommendations and advice for different sectors. So I'm going to start with the state government one. Typically, all state governments have their own job board. And so, like, if you know that you're really interested in working in Delaware, your best bet to find their jobs is to go to Delaware's job board. You know, a lot of state agencies are getting better about putting things on Indeed, and some supervisors may list things on Texas A&M's wildlife job board. But if you know you want to work for a certain agency, go find their job board. And it can actually be helpful even while you're still a student, and you're trying to figure out like what you're interested in. You think you want to be a biologist for, you know, California or whatever. Start looking at their jobs they're posting now. What are their requirements? What are they looking for? Like, what are they saying they expect out of employees when they're applying? And that can really help set you up to get some skills and things to then be qualified for those jobs down the road. Also, government moves slow. Very, very, very slow. Do not expect to apply for a government job and 2 weeks later to have interviewed and find out if you have that job. Typically there is a lot slower timelines than that. I think this is a bit of an extreme example probably, but I think I applied for my job in late summer. I got contacted about an interview in November, December. I interviewed in February and I started in May. So it was almost a full year later after I had applied for the job. Now, usually, again, that might be a little on the extreme side. It's not usually quite that slow, but it really depends. There's a lot that goes into state agencies and hiring, and whether there's pre-review boards before you get to the supervisors, and finding time for everyone on the panel to be available. And it's very tough and it's very slow. So patience is key if you're applying for state government jobs. Patience is probably key if you're applying for any government jobs, but especially state government jobs. Be patient. It's okay to check in at some point after you've applied to be like, hey, do you know anything about the timeline? Because you don't want to be like emailing every week to be like, where is it now? Where is it now? Where is it now? Because then you could get pegged as an annoyance and you don't want that. And then being a biologist doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Like you might be like, yes, I want to be a biologist for a state, but what does that actually mean? You know, in Wisconsin, their biologists cover 1 or 2 counties. They do wildlife surveys and they do habitat management. So up there, you know, so like having a red card for prescribed fire could be helpful because they're doing active land management. In Indiana, our district wildlife biologists are typically working on habitat management plans for private landowners, and they're helping people with wildlife conflicts. So strong habitat management knowledge and communication skills can be really important because you got to be able to communicate practical management to landowners rather than doing it yourself. But then out in Montana, they have regional wildlife biologists that really collect a ton of data. They do surveys, they help with research projects, and they kind of feed that up into the system for decision making. So that's 3 different types of biologists, right? So again, you can say you want to be a state biologist, but what does that actually mean? Where do your interests actually lie? And you kind of want to do some research on the states you might be interested in to see what the work they consider their biologists doing.
All right, so academia. In academia, there are jobs beyond just faculty or instructors. There are often opportunities to become a lab or field technician or manager. It's depends on what school. Some that are more wildlife angled will post on Texas A&M, but you could also, if you're interested in managing a lab in one capacity or other, certain colleges and faculty will post positions that are open. It is important to distinguish with faculty versus teaching versus research, and actually instructor positions. Those are actually generally most schools treat them differently. And then of course there's grad school applications, which are a whole other can of worms, but having a very nicely formatted CV definitely puts a lot of grad students above the other ones that don't necessarily have the structure that we're talking about today. We can switch slides. The big thing about academia is there are a lot of people graduating with advanced degrees that are looking for academic positions. So you really need to make yourself that standout. You must really, really sell yourself. The CV is the first thing that most people look at least when I'm on a hiring board, I look at the CV before I look at the cover letter or the teachings and research statements. And honestly, if you're looking at academic positions, really you need to figure out what makes you excited. What type of academic position are you looking for? Do you want to do straight up research and then teach a couple classes? Those positions are often highly, highly competitive and very, very rigorous. So you're going to need a few postdocs before you get to that point. Definitely read the description of the job. There are so many times I work at a teaching college, looking through applications and they're talking research, which is a great thing to have. But if you are applying for a teaching position, you need to emphasize that you are someone that wants to teach. And so many times folks get a teaching position and realize, I want to get back into the research, or the other way around. I'm really not big on writing $1 million grants. I would rather teach. So make sure as you're going through the job description, you are aware of what that job actually is looking for. If it's a primarily teaching position with, oh yeah, if you want to do research, that's going to be fun. Make sure you emphasize your teaching philosophy and spend more time on that and emphasize your teaching experiences on your CV. Whereas if you're looking for a more research-based position, then you want to emphasize what type of research projects you've had, what types of grants you've gotten, what makes you that much better than everybody else that's applying for that position. So not only is your CV very important, your cover letter, your research statement, and your teaching philosophy, those are all extremely important aspects of your application package overall. But most folks generally go right to the cover letter and the CV, and then if they like what they see on the CV and they like what they see on the cover letter, then they'll go into the research statements and teaching philosophies. But be very, very focused on exactly what that job description is asking for, because if you are an amazing researcher and you say nothing about teaching, if you're applying for a teaching position, you'll get skipped right over, even if you are one of the best teachers in the world. So you need to make sure It's not a generic letter. You are tailoring your CV and everything in your packet to that particular job.
Okay, and I'm going to talk about federal positions. And there are some real similarities here to what Jerry Ann was talking about. For example, the slowness to hire and studying up on what the job categories are for the different entities. Next slide, please. Within the federal government, there's a couple different places where most of the wildlife jobs are. Most of them are going to be in the Department of Interior. You guys are familiar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs. USGS hires a lot. So within Interior, there's lots of jobs. And even just within Interior alone, there's a lot of different flavors to those jobs. Even more broadly, when you start to then factor in the wildlife jobs that can be found in the Department of Agriculture, the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, has a lot of jobs. Every state's got NRCS branches and then different levels within them. U.S. Forest Service, of course, Wildlife Services, the entity that I work for. So we're the wildlife branch of USDA. Here I am using using abbreviations and acronyms. There's USDA, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Wildlife Services, and then the military. In the Department of Defense, there's quite a few wildlife jobs. Over the years, I've done a lot of work on different military installations, and I've had guys who worked for me who went on to work for the DoD. There's a lot of jobs there to be had also. Okay, some of the types of terms and how things will look when you're applying for federal jobs. A lot of this is going to be on USA Jobs, which you're applying through. So check that out. Get online, look at USA Jobs, start studying these announcements, and get familiar with how to read these things. This particular one, the position title is wildlife biologist. To me, being in the government for so long, oh, wildlife biologist, so that's a series 486. And I know that person has, and I'll go into it a little bit more here in next slides. I'll know a lot about their basic education. If they're qualifying for a 486, there's the series and so the 486 is the series. Another real common one that you'll be applying for is 404. That's the biological technician series, biological sciences series. And then you've got the grade levels, depending on the amount of education and what's required, and the skills, abilities required for a job depends on that grade level. And I'll get into that here next. Why don't you flip to the next slide? So the 404 series, biological science technician, that's where a lot of people start out as. And the position description can be very generic because across wildlife services, we might be using just a very few position descriptions for these 404 series, kind of entry level, which is GS 5 usually with a bachelor's degree, 7, maybe 9 with a master's degree. The PD position description might be pretty general, but then look real close at specialized skills and experiences. They let people like me, who's hiring somebody, put in some bullets of specialized experiences, and that's what the job really is, right? So that you got to qualify for that PD, but then if you see some specific points in there, that's what the hiring official, that your future supervisor, is really looking for. So focus on those to determine, first of all, if you even want the job, and then if you've got the skills, education, experiences for it. So from the pictures I have in this slide here, some of our jobs require range riding. So if it may not be in your work experience or education, but if for a hobby or on your home place, you've been riding a horse all your life, be sure to plug that in. If you've been doing some kind of husbandry of chickens or turkeys or livestock of whatever sort, if the job relates to animal care and you've been caring for animals, you need to highlight those sorts of things. So keep those points in mind, the specialized experiences are what that hiring official is going to be looking at. Next slide. And then at the 486 level, that requires some basic education requirements too, a little bit more than the biological science technician does. And these Wildlife Services keeps in line with the Wildlife Society's requirements to become an associate and certified wildlife biologist. We keep it right in line with that. Actually, once you're in Wildlife Services, you can be working toward getting those certifications if you didn't quite make the cut, because some things that I'd change if I were God right now, right, would be that 9 semesters of botany or related plant sciences. You know, if my job requires a lot of mapping, somebody who's got GIS skills, a lot of GPS skills, because they took classes in that, they're more attractive to me than the person who might check the boxes for these 486 requirements, but they had to sacrifice and not take a botany class, but they took that GIS class, for example. Okay, next, Jerry Ann. You can go to the next, kind of covered that. So some of the nuances associated with applying for federal jobs, like I mentioned, USA Jobs. That's where all of our jobs are advertised over for sure. They're going to be advertised on USA Jobs. But also most of us in the wildlife field, we also put them in other places too. Jerry Ann mentioned earlier the Texas A&M site. I always send them to the Texas A&M site. If the job that I'm hiring is in the northern part of the country, Midwest, Northeast, I always make sure that I get it on Michigan State University's career site too. So we'll put them in multiple places. But the links, there's always going to be a link to that, ultimately to that USA job site. So be sure to get used to looking at that. And then go ahead, Jerry Ann. And then there's some real differences in applying for jobs through USA Jobs for a federal job that's different than state jobs, academic jobs, jobs in the private sector. I've kind of said some of this already, but this is your primary way to communicate your education, skills, and experience to get past the first cut. You know, if 50 resumes roll in for a job and an HR type person is the one who's grading those out, I'm being redundant here on purpose, is grading those out. If you don't tick the boxes that they need to tick to then get your CV onto that hiring official, that person will never see it. So, like I mentioned, you don't want to exaggerate. You don't want to blow things out of proportion, but you do want to get onto that next cut in an honest, sincere way. We always emphasize following directions. When the stack of resumes or CVs is this thick, if somebody didn't follow one direction, for example, with some of these federal jobs, it may be including transcripts. They didn't include the transcripts. That HR person may say, oh, this application package is incomplete, and toss it. So you never even got the chance to make the cut. So be real cognizant of that. And also I wanted to point out, after you apply for the job formally, there's also another spot where you can upload other documents. And this is a place that you can put a cover letter, for example. And so that's a way to kind of personalize your very generic, forced to be generic USA Jobs application. Is a cover letter there. Sometimes people will upload a different copy of their CV, like the more personalized version of their CV, and that's fine to do. I find myself looking at those because it gives me a better flavor for that individual than the kind of cold government way to do it. Okay, next. To learn more about jobs, this is specifically within USDA, APHIS, Wildlife Services, and NWRC. These are some links to some of our information. Then I've got Marnie Pepper's email address there too. Marnie's with our operational oh my gosh, I didn't want to say an abbreviation, but I'm not sure I know what the
What
OSS
does it stand for?
operational support services. And Colin plays a big role in our outreach across all of wildlife services. And she'll be from people like me and to sit in a booth with her at TWS if you're going to that, but mine will be behind that desk too. And online, these resources here, there's a lot of information about jobs within our agency and chase down the same kind of paths for USGS, other Department of Interior entities you're interested in, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, all those sorts of opportunities.
Okay, so wrapping up with some plugs and reminders of resources. Like we said, conferences can be a great place to get your resume reviewed by professionals. At the Wildlife Society conference coming up in Baltimore, if you're attending that, there's resume review sessions Sunday afternoon and Monday and Tuesday mornings. So you can look for them on the program. They're also doing a couple kind of career panel times. There's a Careers with Nonprofit on Monday morning. And there's a fitting in with a Fed session Tuesday from 8:30 to noon. Seek out those kinds of opportunities to learn more about different sectors, talk to people who are doing those jobs, and get more eyes on your CV. There's also those, they'll have resume review sessions at state conferences or regional conferences. Some of those Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies or the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies will typically have resume review sessions. And then just a final reminder, we have a tips document as a PDF, and we have several example CVs that can give you a starting point to build off of, available at all of our working groups' various web pages, the Hunting, Trapping, Conservation Working Group, the Early Career Professional Working Group, and the Student Development Working Group, both their website and their Discord for the Student Development Working Group. Hunting and Trapping does not have a Discord. We're not that cool. But we do have it up on our website. So you can go down those resources, have a version of the tips document that you can keep. It's got even a little more advice in it than what we talked about today. It's got examples of skills to include, all those kinds of things. And like we said, there's also some example CVs there to kind of give you inspiration.
Thank you all for that great presentation. I've been answering some of the questions live. So if you go to the Q&A box and you click over to the Answered tab, I may have already answered your questions while our presenters were talking, but I'm going to go through now as many as we have time for some of these questions. And some are along a similar vein. But Jerry Ann, could you cover what those CV review panels at the conference actually look like for folks who may have not gone to one before?
Yeah, so typically there's just a bunch of tables and there's professionals sitting on one side and you just like go sit in a chair and wait your turn. And sometimes they can have you sign up for certain time slots, but a lot of times it's first come, first serve. So you just show up, resume in hand, make sure you have it printed. Ideally, I've had people hand me like iPads and stuff, and we can do it that way, but I'm old. I like to write on things. So like having a printed copy of your CV, then you will just be set up with someone, a professional who volunteered their time to be there. Hand your CV over, they'll give you some suggestions, see if they note anything. And yeah, they're usually, I think they aim for like 10 or 15 minutes per review. So
Yeah, great. So here's a question. When's a case where you shouldn't add information from a past job, such as if the previous job was maybe irrelevant to the one you're applying for, or let's say it was a bad experience that you didn't enjoy, or maybe you now no longer want to be associated with that past organization? I guess I'll open that to anybody.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that one. You aren't going to want big gaps. Like if you've got your work experience listed and there's a 5-year empty gap, that could leave a hiring official kind of wondering, oh, what happened? What was this person doing at that time? So be cognizant of leaving a big hole. If it's something you're not the most proud of, like you're applying for a job for me, and you've worked with some radical animal rights group, that could be a turnoff to me. I totally get not wanting to have it, but you may have it there to some degree, maybe just not build it up or address it if you can get to the interview aspect of it. Those are a couple of quick little thoughts. If it really isn't very relevant, just don't have a whole lot of meat to it. But that federal system in that USA Jobs I mentioned, you've got to list supervisors and that work experience. So if you just miss some years, an idea, you could account for that block in your CV somehow to say that during that period you were, whatever you were up to, taking care of a parent or something. There might be ways to honestly address it.
Yeah. And I think like small time gaps aren't a big deal. Like if it was like a 4-month internship and it was not a good experience. Like often you can list the things you learned as skills, but you don't need to necessarily list that position. It's when you get into kind of the longer gaps that people might be like, what happened for this? Like Kurt said, 5 years, that's like a long time. But if it's like 3 or 4 months, 6 months, like I personally typically don't look twice at short gaps like that because, life happens. And the other thing I often recommend with students in this regard, because a lot of times, like you're a student, you don't have a lot of experience. You're like, your jobs have been working at Chili's and, like hosting or umpiring Little League games. So when you're really starting out and you're a student and you don't have a lot of experience, it's okay to still list those, but just talk up the things that are kind of universal. Highlight the good customer service skills you learned. Highlight, how your communication skills, like how to work as a team, things like that that are kind of universal across jobs. And then as you get more experience that's wildlife specific, you can kind of start dropping some of those off that aren't super relevant, but highlight out of those jobs the things that are pretty universal, like communication, customer service, teamwork, things like that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Val.
I was just going to mention you could also do separate category. You could do relevant work experience and then other work experience. And that's what I generally encourage my students to do. And especially if you are working something as like retail throughout your entire undergraduate career, it shows that you are working and it shows that you have the drive to be able to make money and go to school at the same time, or you're filling in those gaps because you have the drive to continue working. So it does look good, especially when you're starting out, to add that as other work experience.
And here's a question that's somewhat tied to this. So, how far back do you suggest that you list work experience? Should they list jobs all the way back in high school as long as they're relevant to the job they're applying for?
I typically recommend to people starting with college and moving forward. The only time I would recommend listing things from high school is if they are like super relevant. Like you literally like the jobs to do animal care and you had an animal care job for 2 years in high school. Or occasionally pulling in something that's like a huge achievement, like if you were a Boy Scouts of America Eagle Scout, like occasionally there's a big achievement like that that clearly demonstrates a lot of commitment, leadership, and effort. That's okay to list, but generally you're looking at college forward. That's usually my advice. What about you two?
Well, I mean, if you spent your entire childhood working on a farm, farm skills, you could list that under skills, not necessarily maybe job.
Yep.
But say you could phrase it that you have a significant farm experience from a young age, or tractor skills, or list that way. Because again, that shows that you know how to work, especially if you've worked on a farm. And so adding those skills on there definitely could help.
Yeah, that was actually another question someone had about working on their family farm. So thanks for
Yeah,
answering that.
that should show up in your skills.
So,
Kurt, do you have anything additional with that one?
No, not really. I would say that in the tips document that we share, we've got some ideas of how to couch those other skills and abilities that you may not want to say as a job from when you were real young, but categories that you could classify some of those skills that you learned along the way in.
so speaking of skills, what if it's been a few years and you're maybe not quite as comfortable with backing up a trailer, or let's say you have some experience with R, but maybe it's not the freshest, or it could be you really only have experience with like one or two packages.
I'd say just have a qualifier so that you're not blindsiding anybody. If you're coming out of a program with a bachelor's degree, no one's going to think that you are overly proficient in R. But so you say R, I can look at your transcripts and see what courses you took. I know where you're at. If there's something that you're very proficient at, because not only did you learn R because you're interested in a master's degree and a research position, eventually a PhD, so you're really pounding the statistics and learning above and beyond, and you worked on the side with your professor and you analyzed some data, then you could have a qualifier on there to say, like, to what level of expertise you feel that you have. And you can do that for, a lot of the different kinds of skills that we're talking about here.
Yeah. I will say that, like, if you feel like you are no longer comfortable doing that thing at all, then you should take it off your CV. It's totally okay to have something listed for a while, like ArcGIS, right? Esri, I learned an ArcMap. They've gone to Pro now. I have no damn idea what is happening in Pro. Like, it is very different, right? So I don't know that I would list Arc Pro as like something I'm highly proficient in right now, but I know some of Esri's other materials, like I can use Survey 123 and some of these other things, but I probably would not be listing ArcMap, Arc Pro anymore because I don't know what's going on in Arc Pro. So, but it's totally okay at some point to be like, it has been too long since I learned this. You can take it off.
Yep. And relatedly, there's a question in the chat there about driving tractors and backing trailers. If you were doing that some years ago, and then you got busy with college and classes and things, and you haven't done it, so you don't feel like you want to jump in a truck and do it right now today, I'd still list that. Being a Fed, get yourself, it's true. You have done it. You could get brushed up and be competent at it again really quick, but you don't want to do it solo on day one. That's okay. Go ahead and include that in there. And you could mention it during an interview process, or I wouldn't care if you mentioned it to me on your first day of the job. I don't know how it is for the states or not, Jerry Ann, but if you're working for me, I'm going to have you're going to be taking ATV safety and driver safety. You're going to get so much remedial training. Yeah, working next to my guys and you will not break stride and be just fine.
Yeah. And some of that stuff is a little bit like riding a bike. Like, yeah, I haven't ridden a bike in 8 years, but if someone handed me a bike, I'd figure it out pretty quick. So if it's that kind of skill, like backing a trailer and something like that, some of those instincts will come back pretty quickly.
So here's a good one. What about listing volunteer experience on your CV? Should that be incorporated in your work experience section or a separate section? Um, I personally didn't have a lot of actual jobs before I went into graduate school, so I had work experience and a lot of it was volunteer experience. But what is your guys' opinion on that?
The advice I often give is if it was like, if you were working at the amount you would a job, if you're doing it like 30 to 40 hours a week, it definitely should be under work experience. I have a category for volunteer experience on mine, and it's things like I went out with my friend who was a grad student and helped trap gray squirrels for 3 days. So that I listed as volunteer experience because, like, we set some traps for squirrels and things like that. And I learned a few things there, but it's not something I did long term for a lot of time. So I list that under kind of a volunteer experience where I've been exposed to bear hair stares and, squirrel trapping and some of these other things by going along and helping people, but it's not something I did every day for a while.
Yeah, and like unpaid internships are often like that's true work experience, even though you were not directly paid.
Absolutely.
Okay, Val, I have a question about specific PhD programs. Do you like to see different specifics for tailoring the CV?
I think it's really going to depend on what school you're looking at and what type of program you're looking at. Most posted positions have fairly specific requirements or desires for the particular position. If you are generically applying to a school to look at or to potentially find a professor and join the PhD program, that's a little different. Your CV is going to be a little more generic, but you definitely want to emphasize things like publications and teaching experience and real world field experiences, because it's getting more and more competitive. And a lot of times, if you those cases, I would say contacting the professors that you might want to work with and getting a relationship with those professors prior to your application, and talking about different research projects, that's going to be in a lot of ways more important than your CV. But your CV still has to look properly formatted and have all your you have to have all your ducks in a row. But the communication with potential potential PhD advisors is going to be more important than worrying about necessarily adding or subtracting things from your CV. So the application process is a little bit different that way.
Great. Here's a question about evaluating yourself for different GS levels for federal positions, specifically for someone who might have some amount of education, like a master's, but then they had continuing education outside of graduate school or a formal setting, but they are not sure where they then fall within those kind of typical GS levels.
Yeah, with a master's, you're probably looking at starting at a GS 7 to 9. And if you've got that master's degree in your pocket, plus other work experience that's relevant, that pushes you maybe more toward the 9. But a lot of times, if it's, for example, a 7/9, you're going to end up probably starting at the GS 7 level. And after a year of satisfactory performance, you could get bumped up into that 9 right away. So it's not going to, unless it's several years of experience, it's probably not going to let you open the door to a GS 11 job right off the bat, but it would make you compete better amongst others who are also qualified, but if they got the master's, but they don't have that additional experience beefing up their resume, they may not compete as well as you would.
Jerry Ann, for a state job, and I think this would go for federal jobs too. Um, oh gosh, someone typed a new one and it jumped all the way to the bottom. Sorry. Um, so let's say you didn't get the job. You mentioned that the process is slow, but when should you guess that you haven't gotten the job if you don't formally hear back?
So technically, all states that I know of eventually send you an email through their job system, be like, thank you for applying, but no. But really, if you don't ever hear anything, you should check in with either the HR, or if you know who the hiring manager is, like check in with them and just be like, hey, I just haven't, it's, been a couple months, I hadn't heard anything. I was wondering if it was still in process or if you've managed to fill the position. Just something very, kind and generic, but just a gentle inquiry of like, is this filled or do I need to keep waiting? But as far as I know, almost all states at this point send you a thank you, but no thank you, basically equivalent email if you were not selected of some kind. It's usually very short and through their HR system, but they usually send you something. But again, if it's been, 6-8 months and you haven't heard anything, it's perfectly okay to try to check in with someone just to be like, hey, I was wondering if this has been filled or what the timeline might be for it.
So here's a generic question. When it comes to transcripts, if you don't have a high GPA, will that lessen your chance of having your resume application seen? Um, I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. Personally, I know a colleague who had a 2.3 in an undergrad, and now he's a tenure track professor. So it's a lot about your experience outside of school and who you know. But that is for a specific academic track where he was well connected with the folks he was going to go to grad school with. So for these kind of more standard application jobs, how do you all feel about that?
Yep. I feel for the federal system, as long as you passed the class, it's on the transcript and you passed. The human resource professionals who are grading those out, they're just looking at the transcript to see if you can tick the box, enough credits in each category. The grade's not going to matter. The hiring official may have some thoughts about it and say, oh, geez, this person did not pass calculus. The job I'm hiring for doesn't require calculus. No harm, no foul. So I wouldn't let it slow you down too much.
And when it comes to grad school applications, if you're looking at academia, grades do matter to a degree. But if you have significant life experience or good life experience in between, and you can show that you're actually doing really relevant work, oftentimes some of those grade requirements are either waived or they will ask you to take an undergrad or grad level class in the same general like theme of what your class with the poor grade was in to begin with.
So, is it still good to include a resume and or cover letter for a federal or state job application when it states that the job posting in the job posting those things will not be reviewed?
I guess if it says right in the posting that additional materials will not be reviewed, maybe there's not much point, but I know when I post something, I sneak my name in there somewhere. And others I know a lot of my colleagues do too. I like a cover letter. And if a cover letter is personalized a little bit to the job, or they've done a little bit of homework so they know who USDA Wildlife Services is and the National Wildlife Research Center is and the kind of research my team does, I like that personalization. So I'm not sure that I've seen anything that I've put out there through our HR going through the process that says things won't be reviewed. You know, what that might mean is they aren't going to be reviewed by the HR folks. They're not going to consider them in their little grading to see if you get past the first cut. But I bet you it shows up to me if you make it through that cut, and I use them.
Yeah, I think that's the thing where like obviously you want to follow directions. So it says if it says do not include your cover letter, we do not want it. But if it says something like it won't be considered, that might mean what Kurt was saying, that like that's not how they're going to make their first cut. So if you have relevant experience, it needs to be in your CV because that's what they're considering. But there could still be value for uploading a cover letter once it gets to that hiring manager. Like I think, you know, what I've talked about possibly with some of you is a cover letter is probably never going to get you hired, but it could get you that interview. Right. I always give people like kind of the, you know, equivalent of extra credit for taking the time to include a cover letter that tells me more about them. And I am much more likely to interview them than someone who didn't take the time to provide me that. But if the instructions say very specifically, do not give us a cover letter, always follow the instructions.
Okay, I think we can squeeze in one last question, and there's a couple that are in the same vein. So what if they have a lot of work experience in a completely different field and they're just coming into the wildlife field at, like an older age? They didn't just come fresh out of undergrad or fresh out of high school. How would they market that research or that work experience in like a totally unrelated field?
I think some of that goes back to what I was talking about earlier of like, there are some skills that are universal. And is there a way that you can play up those skills? Like, I basically tell people my job now is being a project manager, right? So a lot of those skills are transferable. You just have to like present them in the right way that people make that connection very easily. Like, don't make them connect the dots, you connect the dots of I am capable of effectively supervising employees and maintaining multiple projects at the same time and some of those things that are kind of, I've, really have a lot of experience and background in communication skills and conflict resolution and some of these things that are kind of universal. That can help people see your value, even if you don't have like that wasn't a wildlife job you were doing that for, but you can do all of these things.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, Kurt, to cut you off. That's really all we have time for today. Thank you all for your time and attention. Again, all our resources are posted on the various working group websites. This recording will be posted on the Wildlife Society's webpage. We also encourage you guys to reach out to our various working groups, as well as community teams. I saw some questions in there about what about extenuating life circumstances that cause big gaps. So reach out to working groups like the Latin American Working Group, the Native American Peoples Working Group, Women of Wildlife out in the field. They might have some suggestions for very specific life circumstances. But also come check out all the events at Baltimore if you're able to attend. So thank you all again for your time.